The field wasn't a runway. It wasn't even flat. It was a shredded strip of frozen mud carved between two tree lines somewhere on the edge of the Ardennes, lit only by the blue glow of a dying dawn. Shells thudded in the distance, the ground trembling like a lung struggling to breathe. A lone P-47 Thunderbolt sat buried to its axles, its propeller blades chipped from yesterday's retreat, its fuselage caked in ice and smoke. Every pilot who touched it had written it off. "She's dead," the crew chief muttered. "Leave it and run." But Thomas Whip Hanlon didn't run. The mechanic stepped into the blast of cold air with a wooden crate in his hands, a crate the size of a coffin. Men stopped what they were doing. Some smirked, others rolled their eyes. They had heard the rumors. Hanlon had built a propeller the testing board had rejected as dangerous, unstable, and aerodynamically incoherent. A propeller that was supposed to be impossible. Hanlon dropped the crate beside the P-47 and pried it open. Inside lay three twisted blades of metal unlike anything the crew had seen. They were curved wrong. They were pitched wrong. They looked more like farm tools than precision aircraft hardware. A corporal scoffed. "That thing won't even spin up." Hanlon didn't answer. He just set the first blade in place with hands that moved too fast for the cold to slow them. Artillery cracked closer. Snow burst into the air behind them. The pilots still on the field stared at the forest beyond the tree line, where German armor was now reported less than a mile away. The order had gone out moments earlier. Abandon the field. Destroy what you can't carry. Fall back before they overrun the position. The last functioning fighters had already taken off, clawing into the sky before the strip became unusable. But one pilot hadn't left. Lieutenant Dane Carter, whose P-47 now sat on its belly like a wounded animal refusing to die. He stood next to Hanlon, watching the impossible propeller lock into place. "You sure this won't rip the engine off?" he asked. Hanlon tightened the last bolt. "No," he said calmly. "But it'll fly." The ground shook as a shell landed just beyond the tree line. Branches snapped. A cloud of earth rolled over the field. Carter climbed into the cockpit without another word. Hanlon slapped the side of the fuselage twice, the signal he'd used since Tunisia. The engine coughed once, then twice, then roared to life with a howl none of the men had heard from a Thunderbolt before. The propeller blurred instantly into a silver disk. Snow blasted sideways from the slipstream. Carter released the brakes. The P-47 didn't roll forward. It jumped, surging like it had been kicked by something under the earth. 3 seconds later, before anyone could gasp, the plane blasted off the ground, climbing past the tree line like a rocket fired too early. Men stood frozen in place, artillery echoing behind them, watching the impossible flight. For the first time in the war, they believed the rumors. Hanlon's impossible propeller worked. To understand why Whip Hanlon's impossible propeller was mocked, you have to understand the iron cage of wartime engineering. In 1944, propeller science wasn't just a discipline. It was a doctrine. Every blade angle, every metal thickness, every aerodynamic curve was regulated by stacks of manuals written by men with degrees, not wrenches. And those manuals were treated like scripture. Pilots trusted horsepower. Engineers trusted data. Commanders trusted tradition. Everyone believed the same thing. You cannot cheat takeoff physics. The drag is too high, the torque too violent, the airflow too unpredictable. At zero airspeed, a propeller is at its weakest. No amount of wishful thinking or backyard tinkering could change that. Or so they believed. Hanlon never bought it. He had spent enough nights on airstrips from North Africa to Italy, watching fighters struggle to get off the ground with full bomb loads. He'd watched pilots push throttle forward and pray the wheels lifted before the trees did. He'd seen P-47s die not from enemy fire, but from bogged-down mud, failed rollouts, washed-out fields, or sheer lack of runway. When he said, "Takeoff kills more fighters than the Luftwaffe," other mechanics laughed. But the numbers didn't. Takeoff-related losses were bleeding squadrons dry. Meanwhile, Hanlon kept asking the question nobody wanted to hear. What if the problem wasn't the plane, but the prop? His supervisors hated that question. The U.S. Army Air Forces didn't encourage creativity. They encouraged compliance. Propellers were manufactured by the thousands, each one stamped to approved specifications. Engineers built them. Mechanics installed them. Nobody improvised. Nobody experimented. And nobody, absolutely nobody, redesigned one in the field. So when Hanlon began sneaking spare blades from the scrap pile, filing edges by hand and testing experimental pitch shapes during off hours, he became a walking violation of protocol. The testing board filed warnings. His commanding officer told him to quit playing mad scientist. One inspector wrote, "Mechanic demonstrates clear misunderstanding of propeller mechanics." They said he was wasting time. Worse, that he was dangerous. But Hanlon possessed something the rulebook engineers didn't. He knew the wind. He knew how it felt, how it pushed, how it could be coaxed into doing things equations claimed impossible. He didn't see propellers as rigid blades. He saw them as tools for capturing invisible currents. His notebooks were filled with sketches and ideas that looked like madness to anyone else. And so the misconception grew. His peers believed propellers were fixed in their capabilities. Hanlon believed they were the most underdeveloped part of the aircraft. The system insisted innovation required permission. Hanlon believed innovation required need. And the day would come, sooner than anyone expected, when that need forced the impossible into reality. Before the war labeled him a troublemaker, Whip Hanlon was just a kid from a wind-burned patch of Oklahoma. His family didn't have much: a barn full of rusting machinery, a few acres of stubborn soil, and a set of chores that started before dawn and ended long after the sun dipped under the plains. But that land and that wind shaped him in ways no engineering school ever could. While other boys learned baseball, Whip learned airflow. He could tell when a storm was coming by how the wheat leaned. He could hear wind direction in the rattle of barn doors. When he fixed the farm's battered generator, he didn't do it by replacing parts. He filed them, bent them, reshaped them until they caught the air just right. Even then, he didn't think in terms of mechanics. He thought in terms of pressure, resistance, lift, the invisible forces that moved across the plains like ghosts. His father used to say, "That boy isn't fixing engines, he's talking to them." And he wasn't wrong. Whip's education came from nights spent tinkering under a kerosene lamp, taking apart fans, windmills, and broken propellers salvaged from crop dusters that crashed in storms. He discovered something no manual taught. Metal doesn't care what it's supposed to do. It only cares how it's shaped and where the wind wants to go. When the war came and recruiters toured the countryside, Whip didn't hesitate. He didn't join out of patriotism or a thirst for glory. He joined because the Army Air Forces promised something his farm couldn't: more machines to take apart, more engines to resurrect, more airflow puzzles to solve. Within months, he was in uniform, assigned to a stateside training field packed with rookie pilots and exhausted instructors. For the first time, he saw rows of P-47s and P-51s lined up like sleeping giants. But while others admired their sleek lines and booming engines, Whip fixated on something else: their flaws. To him, every propeller on the flight line was a compromise, engineered for safety, manufacturability, and mass production, not peak performance. The curved blades were good, but not great. The pitch angles were efficient, but not optimal. The thick roots reduced stress, but robbed acceleration when the plane needed it most. He pointed this out to a lieutenant during his first week and got a warning that stuck with him. "Son, the engineering's done. Your job is to follow the book." That was the moment Whip realized the Air Forces didn't want innovators. They wanted mechanics who obeyed torque specs and timing charts. The irony? Those charts were written by men who never had to coax a dying engine back to life using fence wire and a hammer. Whip kept his thoughts quiet after that, but he didn't stop observing. He watched how planes struggled during takeoff on hot days. He noticed how the prop blades bit the air poorly at low speed. He listened to how the engines strained, how the wings begged for lift the propeller couldn't give them yet. Some men entered the war with ambition. Whip entered it with curiosity, and soon enough that curiosity would collide headfirst with a crisis that no manual could solve. A moment when the only thing standing between life and death was the strange intuition of a farm boy who saw the air differently than everyone else on Earth. Whip's big moment didn't come during a battle. It came on a quiet training morning. Hot, windless, the kind of day when engine heat shimmered above the tarmac like ghosts rising from the ground. Pilots joked lazily, crew chiefs wiped oil off their hands, and instructors prayed the rookies wouldn't wreck another airframe before lunch. At 10:14 a.m., everything changed. A P-51 on its takeoff roll began its routine acceleration. The nose lifted, the tail settled. The wheels skimmed the runway just as they had 1,000 times before. Then the engine barked, a violent cough, a hiccup of power loss, and the Mustang lurched sideways. The pilot wrestled it, correcting too late. One wing dipped, scraped the ground, and the whole aircraft spiraled in a shower of dirt and shards. It wasn't a fiery explosion, just a brutal, bone-rattling crash that felt almost surgical in its suddenness. Whip ran toward the wreck before anyone shouted his name. The pilot climbed out, shaken but alive, cursing the engine like it had betrayed him personally. Officers quickly blamed pilot error. Crew chiefs blamed heat soak. But Whip didn't buy any of it. Engines didn't cough like that unless something upstream choked them. Airflow disruption, torque imbalance, or a prop that momentarily stalled the slipstream. And Whip had seen that exact shudder once before, on a busted crop duster back home after its propeller was filed wrong by a green hand. He crouched beside the wrecked P-51 and inspected the propeller blades. All four were intact, yet subtly wrong. The pitch angle was uniform, as the manual demanded, but the wear patterns near the tips told another story. The blade was starving for clean air in the first 2 seconds of takeoff, forcing the engine into a micro-stall before power caught up. It was a flaw so minor no desk-bound engineer would ever notice. But to someone who studied the way air talked to metal, it was glaring. He kept that thought to himself until the second Mustang went down. Same angle, same cough, same sickening drift off the runway. This time the pilot broke his collarbone, and this time Whip spoke up, telling the senior mechanic, "Sir, it's the blade pitch. It's fighting the air instead of pulling it. They'll all do it on hot days." The senior mechanic laughed, not out of cruelty, but out of certainty. "Kid, the propeller's designed by PhDs. You think you know something they don't?" The conversation ended there, but Whip couldn't let it go. A dozen small crashes over the next 3 weeks confirmed his suspicion. Heat, humidity, high RPM at low roll speed. Combine those with the factory standard pitch setting, and every P-51 on that base was flirting with disaster. What made it worse was the quiet fear sinking into the squadron. Pilots hesitated to take off. Instructors added extra prayers before rolling down the runway. Even the brass sensed something was wrong, but the manuals showed nothing. And engineers at Wright Field insisted the design was flawless. Whip knew better. He'd seen windmills stall, fans seize, and propellers misbehave under invisible conditions city engineers never accounted for. The problem wasn't the engine. It wasn't the fuel. It wasn't even pilot technique. It was the air, and the fact that the propellers weren't shaped to meet it the way the Oklahoma wind had taught him they should. His officers shrugged off his warning. But fate wasn't done raising the stakes. The next crash wouldn't just break a plane. It would trigger the moment that forced Whip to choose between the rule book and the lives depending on him. Night operations at the training field were rare, but that evening the base commander ordered an emergency round of tests. 2 crashes in a month was a statistic. 3 was a pattern. 4, which had happened that afternoon, was becoming a scandal. Pilots whispered that the Mustangs were cursed. Instructors whispered that they'd rather fly blindfolded than take off again in daylight heat. Something had to be done, and the brass wanted answers before sunrise. By dusk, the runway was lit with lanterns, flood lamps, and whatever bulbs the mechanics could scavenge. The smell of gasoline clung to the warm air. Engines idled in a line like restless beasts waiting to be unleashed. Officers watched from clipboards. Pilots checked straps twice, then a third time. The tension had weight. Whip moved among the aircraft quietly, listening to each engine's breathing, feeling the vibration through the skin of the fuselage. The sounds confirmed his fear. Every one of those P-51s carried the same flaw in its prop. It was subtle, buried deep in the opening seconds of takeoff. But once you knew what to listen for, the slight flutter in the RPM surge, the faint dip in torque, it was unmistakable. The first Mustang rolled down the runway at 2017. Power surged. The engine roared. Everyone held their breath. For a moment, the climb looked clean. Then the nose wobbled, the tail shivered, and the aircraft barely clawed itself into the air. The pilot circled back, landing with white knuckles and trembling hands. "It felt like it wanted to kill me," he said, refusing the clipboard for notes. The second pilot aborted mid-roll, slamming the brakes and skidding to a cloud of dust. He climbed out and threw his helmet on the ground. "Not again. I'm done gambling my life on something nobody understands." The field fell silent. Officers exchanged anxious looks. The commander muttered under his breath, "If these birds can't take off reliably, they'll never survive combat. We are training men to fly coffins." Whip knew this was the moment to speak or stay quiet and watch another plane crash. He approached the line of officers cautiously. His boots echoed on the tarmac, and every mechanic turned to watch. The commander, tired and irritable, looked up. "What is it, Davies?" Whip swallowed his fear. "Sir, the prop pitch readings are wrong." A captain scoffed. "The factory says they're perfect." "Well, the factory isn't down here cleaning blood off the runway," Whip replied, louder than he meant to. Pilots froze. Officers stiffened. But Whip pushed on. He pointed toward the dim lantern light reflecting off one of the propellers. "Sir, look at the blade tips. They're eating the slipstream before the aircraft builds proper airflow. It starves the engine for 2 seconds. That's long enough to stall lift." The commander raised an eyebrow. "And what makes you so certain?" Whip took a breath. "Because I've fixed windmills with this exact same problem. And because I've watched 4 planes prove me right." Silence. Then the commander sighed, the sound of a man out of options. "Fine, show me." Whip stepped forward, adjusted the propeller pitch by a few degrees. Tiny changes, mere slivers of angle, but enough to redirect the initial bite of air, and tightened the bolts. He wiped his hands on his coveralls and signaled for the test pilot. The pilot, skeptical but brave, climbed in. The engine turned, roared, settled. The Mustang shot down the runway. This time the nose lifted clean. No cough. No wobble. No tail flutter. The plane surged into the sky like it had been waiting its whole life for this one perfect takeoff. When the Mustang returned, its pilot stepped out with a stunned expression. "What the hell did you do to my plane?" he asked. Whip answered quietly, "I let it breathe." From that moment on, whispers spread across the field. Not about cursed Mustangs, but about the mechanic who understood airflow better than the people who designed the planes. Word of Whip's midnight miracle spread faster than any official memo. By sunrise, half the squadron's pilots were hovering around him like anxious cattle waiting for a storm to pass. They didn't care about regulations, inspections, or the risk of reprimand. They cared about staying alive. And for the first time in weeks, they'd seen a Mustang take off without trying to kill the man inside it. The officers, however, were not celebrating. At 0610, Whip was summoned to the command tent. 2 MPs stood outside, not to arrest him, but to make it clear the meeting wasn't optional. Inside sat the base commander, an engineering liaison from right field, and a major who looked like he hadn't smiled since the Hoover administration. The propeller diagram lay unfolded on the table, its angles pristine, perfect, factory-issued, and very, very wrong. The major pointed at it with the cold precision of a man who lived for rule books. "Davies, you changed a factory-certified propeller pitch without authorization. Do you understand the severity of that offense?" Whip did. Unauthorized modifications were grounds for court-martial. Even suggesting the blueprints were flawed bordered on heresy. But he also understood the severity of dead pilots. He stood his ground. "Sir, with respect, the pitch setting is killing our men. We're losing aircraft on takeoff, not in combat. If you let me adjust the rest of the props, we can fix this before more—" The liaison cut him off. "You're a mechanic, not an engineer." Whip didn't blink. "Yes, sir. And that's why I know what a Mustang looks like right before it dies." Silence settled like fog. The men across the table exchanged glances, calculating risk, weighing pride against reality. The commander finally spoke, his voice rough but honest. "We tested it last night. It worked." The major bristled. "One test proves nothing." The commander didn't move. 4 crashes in a month prove plenty." The room went still. The tension was a live wire stretching across the table, humming with the clash between bureaucracy and survival. Whip realized he was watching something important, not just a debate, but the moment doctrine bowed to reality. The commander exhaled through his nose. "I'm authorizing field adjustments on a limited trial." The major nearly choked. "That violates every—" "Then write it up," the commander snapped. "And while you're writing, I'll be over at the flight line preventing funerals." The decision was final. Whip walked out of the tent to the sight of 30 mechanics waiting in a semicircle, watching him with tired eyes and grease-stained faces. He didn't give a speech, didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Grab your tools, we're fixing Mustangs today." What followed became legend. Prop after prop was corrected, each adjustment taking no more than a few minutes, but saving lives measured in decades. The Mustangs ran smoother, climbed steadier, leapt off the runway with a confidence that pilots hadn't felt since basic training. The transformation was immediate and undeniable. By noon, 3 test flights were completed, each flawless. By evening, the squadron's readiness level was higher than it had been in months. By nightfall, even the most skeptical pilots were volunteering to fly the Davies-fixed Mustangs. But the real confirmation came from the sky. During a twilight test, a young lieutenant named Collins took off after insisting on being the guinea pig. He soared upward and radioed back, voice crackling with disbelief. "This thing climbs like it's got something to prove." Ground crews erupted in cheers. Pilots clapped Whip on the back. And for the first time since arriving at the training field, the man who kept engines alive finally allowed himself a small, reluctant smile. No orders had made this happen. No factory blueprint had saved them. This miracle came from a grease-backed mechanic who trusted his hands more than the paperwork in Washington. And deep down, every man on that field knew a truth they'd never say out loud. If the forbidden propeller fix hadn't happened that night, half the squadron might never have left the ground alive. The first mission after Whip's fix was the kind of quiet morning that made pilots uneasy. A thin gray haze hung over the runway, muting the metallic shine of the Mustangs lined up in formation. The pilots stood beside their aircraft, helmets under their arms, each man pretending he wasn't waiting for someone else to move first. No one said it out loud, but they all knew the truth. Today would prove whether Whip's forbidden adjustment was genius or suicide. Lieutenant Collins was the first to break the tension. He tightened his chin strap, slapped the side of his newly corrected Mustang, and said, "If this bird kills me, Davies, you're burying me face down." Whip nodded without a smile. He'd heard jokes like that from pilots who didn't live long enough to repeat them. One by one, engines coughed awake, except now the cough didn't turn into desperate choking. Instead, each Mustang smoothed out into a purring roar that sent a ripple through the airfield. Pilots exchanged looks. Crews looked up from their tools. The difference wasn't subtle. It was loud, physical, undeniable. These engines weren't fighting themselves anymore. They wanted to fly. When the first Mustang rolled down the runway, Whip felt his stomach clench. He'd spent more nights staring at broken P-51s than he could count. He knew how easily a beautiful machine could turn into a death trap. The aircraft accelerated, straight, stable, no sudden yawing, no violent torque pulling it sideways. It lifted before reaching the halfway marker, climbing with a confidence that made ground crews murmur in disbelief. The second Mustang took off 30 seconds later. Same result. Clean, smooth, strong. The third followed, then the fourth. All perfect. By the time the last pair roared into the sky, even the skeptical ordnance chief muttered, "Hell, I guess the bastard did it." Up above, the pilots saw the difference even clearer. At 6,000 feet, Collins checked in over radio. "Squadron, form up. And somebody tell Davies, this thing climbs like it's got a grudge." Laughter crackled across the airwaves, something no one had heard in weeks. The Mustangs rose in a clean arc, gliding into formation without lagging, without wobbling, without struggling against their own propeller pitch. Whip listened from the ground with folded arms. He didn't smile. He never did when lives were still in motion. But the sound of their voices told him everything. A few minutes later, the test became combat. Unscheduled, unplanned, unavoidable. A German reconnaissance aircraft, likely a Ju-88, had wandered too close to the coastline, unaware a suddenly revitalized American squadron was circling overhead. Collins spotted it first. "Eyes up, boys. We've got a visitor." The squadron leader hesitated. This was supposed to be a test flight, not a fight. But the Ju-88 banked hard toward Germany, and instinct took over. "Engage, keep it clean." 6 Mustangs peeled off like silver arrows. Whip stood on the runway, hands tightening around his rag. He knew what was happening without hearing a single word. The change in engine pitch, the surge of distant thunder. Those were the sounds of Mustangs diving into combat. Collins' voice cut through the static. "Closing fast. Jesus, this thing is quick." The Ju-88's crew saw the Mustangs racing down from the sun, far faster than earlier American squadrons had ever moved. They tried to dive away. They didn't stand a chance. The Mustangs caught the bomber in seconds. 1 burst, 2. A trail of smoke appeared behind the Ju-88 as it rolled, dipped, and disappeared into the sea. The radio crackled again. A pilot who had lost 3 wingmen in a single month whispered, "Davies, you saved us." Whip finally let out a long breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Not because he felt pride, but because for once, everything had worked the way it should. The forbidden fix wasn't a theory anymore. It was a weapon. It had just claimed its first victory. 2 days after the Ju-88 went down, German intercept operators at a coastal listening post filed a routine report, though nothing about it seemed routine to the officer who read it. The report noted a formation of American fighters climbing at a rate far exceeding typical engagement capability, closing distance on a reconnaissance aircraft in less than half the expected time. At first, the German major assumed exaggeration or miscalculation. But when cross-checks from 2 radar stations confirmed the same impossible numbers, he realized something was wrong. American fighters were climbing faster than models predicted, and faster than German pilots had ever encountered. That kind of acceleration didn't just happen. It meant a change, new tactics, new hardware, or some form of mechanical breakthrough that intelligence hadn't caught. And if it wasn't on their radar yet, it would be soon. The next time the Luftwaffe met the newly revived Mustang squadron, they were flying Bf-109Gs. Fast, sharp-climbing interceptors, the backbone of Germany's fighter defense. Their pilots had been briefed. American fighters are improving. Expect uncharacteristic performance. Take nothing for granted. What the Germans weren't told, because no one at headquarters believed it, was that the Americans might actually be faster. So when the Mustangs appeared behind the German formation only minutes after the scramble order, the Bf-109 pilots assumed they'd been ambushed or that their timing had been off. They climbed to escape, confident in the 109's high-altitude performance. But the Mustangs followed them, not slowly gaining, not struggling upward, but matching their climb angle foot for foot, accelerating as if pulled by unseen cables. Collins's radio call sliced through the comms. "They're not leaving us. Stay on them." The Americans pulled their throttles wide open, engines howling with the new razor-smooth intensity Whip's adjustment had unlocked. The P-51s didn't surge or buck when they hit maximum power. They just went, clean, stable, like the aircraft had finally discovered the shape it was meant to fly. German pilots cursed into their masks, confused, panicking in a way they hadn't since 1943. One yelled, "They climb like rockets." Another shouted, "Impossible! Mustangs cannot catch us this high." But they were being caught, and fast. The altimeters ticked upward, 16,000 feet, then 18,000, then 21,000. The oxygen masks hissed, engines strained. The sky got thinner and brighter. The lead Mustang lined up the shot first. Collins squeezed the trigger and the .650 caliber Browning spat fire into the thin air. The rounds tore through the Messerschmitt's fuselage. The German pilot bailed out within seconds, his canopy flipping away, his chute erupting in a white blossom as his fighter spiraled downward, trailing smoke. The other 109 split, diving hard to escape. Dive speed had always been the Mustang's territory, but the Germans still expected the Americans to hesitate. They didn't. The P-51s plunged after them like hawks on rabbits, the airflow screaming past their canopies as altitude bled away in huge gulps. The speed differential was undeniable. The Germans weren't just outflown, they were outclassed. Back on the ground, Luftwaffe intelligence struggled to understand what had happened. Reports described Mustangs climbing with unnatural acceleration and engines that produced no torque wobble, both of which sounded impossible. Engineers demanded data. Pilots demanded answers. Commanders demanded to know whether the Americans had introduced a new fuel mixture, an upgraded supercharger, or worse, an entirely new engine. Meanwhile, the squadron Collins led landed safely, engines cooling, canopies lifting. The ground crews didn't celebrate loudly. The victory wasn't about pride, it was about survival. They had just proven that Whip Davies's illegal modification didn't merely help, it gave them something the Luftwaffe was running out of rapidly. Time. And now the Germans knew it too. Whip Davies didn't return from the mission as a hero. He returned as a suspect. The moment his boots hit the steel-perforated runway, a maintenance officer was already waiting, clipboard in hand, jaw tight, eyes locked on the engine cowling of Collins's Mustang, like it was a crime scene. Whispered reports had reached the command tent before the squadron even taxied in. Mustangs climbing too fast, accelerating too cleanly, engines running with a strange high-frequency smoothness. Something had changed, and everyone knew it. And in a war where every part had a serial number and every procedure a signature, change didn't mean innovation. It meant violation. The officer barked for the cowlings to be opened. Whip didn't argue. He knew this day would come. He'd been pushing the boundary from the moment he realized the standard airflow balance inside the Merlin engine was wasting power at altitude. The twist he made, less than 1/8 of an inch of realignment, didn't appear on any blueprint. No manual allowed it. Factories didn't approve it. Yet it had transformed the Mustang's high-altitude performance in a way the engineers back home hadn't thought possible. It was the kind of fix that genius saw instantly and bureaucracy punished immediately. And now the bureaucracy was here. As the metal panels came off, the officer leaned in, scanning the engine lines with hawk-like intensity. The other mechanics pretended to keep working, but their ears were tuned to every muttered word. Whip wiped his hands deliberately on a rag, keeping his face unreadable. Inside, his pulse thumped like a piston misfiring. The officer frowned. He knew the Merlin intimately. He knew how it should look, how it should breathe, how it should sound. And what lay before him wasn't right. Something had been moved, subtle, clever, nearly invisible, but not factory standard. "What is this?" the officer demanded. Whip answered calmly. "A correction." "A violation," the officer snapped. "You altered a mission-critical component without authorization." Whip didn't flinch. "I did what kept our boys alive." The air went still. Pilots drifted closer. Collins stepped forward silently. His flight suit half unzipped and his face streaked with sweat and exhaust grime. He knew exactly what was at stake. Mechanics could be court-martialed for unauthorized modifications. Punishments ranged from grounding to confinement. And in a war this unforgiving, losing a mechanic like Whip was more damaging than losing a truckload of spare parts. Collins spoke gently but firmly. "Sir, with that fix, my plane climbed better than anything in the sky today. I wouldn't be standing here without it." The officer didn't look convinced. "Performance isn't the issue. Regulations exist because if every mechanic did whatever they wanted, we'd have chaos." Whip stepped forward, lowering his voice. "If we follow the book when the book's wrong, we'll have casualties instead." His tone wasn't rebellious. It was weary, honest. The tone of a man who'd watched too many pilots die because an engine didn't give them the power it could have. The officer exhaled, the kind that carried frustration rather than authority. He wasn't a villain. He was a man crushed by responsibility. One unauthorized mod could, in theory, destroy an engine mid-air. But 3 German fighters had gone down today. Every American pilot came home. The results were impossible to ignore. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "This never happened. Do you understand?" Whip nodded. No celebration, no relief. Just the quiet acceptance of a man who knew he'd won a small war inside the larger one. The officer leaned closer, almost whispering. "Fix the others exactly the same way. But if anyone asks, I ordered it." Whip allowed himself the slightest smile. Not pride, just purpose. He turned back toward the row of waiting P-51s, tools dangling from his fingers, and the pilots followed him with a kind of reverence usually reserved for aces. The risk hadn't just almost shut him down. It had nearly shut down the future of their squadron. Next, Whip would prove that his fix wasn't a miracle. It was a formula. In the quiet hours after sundown, while most of the pilots were asleep or pretending to be, Whip Davies sat alone in the dim glow of a single bulb inside the maintenance tent. Outside, the Normandy airfield hummed with distant artillery and the low murmur of generators. But inside, there was only the steady scratch of pencil on paper. The Mustang that returned victorious today hadn't been a fluke. It hadn't been luck, magic, or some unrepeatable accident. It was a system, a formula hiding in the guts of the Merlin engine, waiting for someone stubborn enough, reckless enough, or brilliant enough to see it. Whip drew the airflow lines first, then the manifold curves, then the pressure pockets that normally suffocated the Merlin above 25,000 feet. Engineers back home had tried to fix the Mustang's high-altitude dip by adding supercharger stages, strengthening pistons, even redesigning intercoolers. All valuable, but all working around a deeper flaw. The engine wasn't breathing wrong. It was breathing unevenly. One side overfed, the other side starved. The Germans had the same problem in their inline engines, and it limited their jets and props alike. But the fix was so simple, so unorthodox, so offensively small, that no engineer in a polished office would ever consider it. Whip had. And now he could prove why it worked. He sketched pressure differentials, comparing the before and after of Collins's flight data. Even with the limited instruments Mustangs carried, the climb rate spike was undeniable. The engine's thermal profile showed fewer hotspots. Fuel distribution became almost symmetrical. The modified manifold curve tightened like a perfect bowstring. With the twist applied, the supercharger no longer had to brute force its way into high altitude. It flowed there. And once airflow became smooth, the Merlin did exactly what Rolls-Royce designed it to do. Unlock horsepower no American pilot had ever fully felt. Whip leaned back, rubbing his eyes. The numbers didn't just hold up. They sang. The tent flap rustled. Collins entered quietly, setting down 2 steaming cups of bitter field coffee. He glanced at the sprawling sketches. "You really think you can teach this to the other crews?" Whip didn't hesitate. "I can make every Mustang in this squadron climb like yours did today." "Every Mustang in Europe?" Whip paused, then nodded slowly. "If they'll listen." Collins smirked. "They'll listen when they see what it does." Whip tapped the paper. "It's not just speed. It's altitude control. It's cooling efficiency. It's engine stability at redline. This little adjustment changes the entire fight profile. Suddenly, Mustangs can intercept jets before they even finish climbing. They can keep formation at altitude without overheating. They can chase, not just escort." Collins sat down across from him. The glow from the lamp cut harsh shadows across his face, but his eyes were alive. "You're saying this is more than a mod?" Whip gave a small, tired grin. "It's a doctrine." And he wasn't exaggerating. The Luftwaffe was betting everything on altitude advantage and jet acceleration. Germany's Me-262s needed long, vulnerable climbs. Their Bf-109s needed perfect boost to fight above 25,000 feet. If American fighters could rise faster, stay cooler, and maintain sustained power at altitude, the entire air war shifted. No more sprinting escorts, no more defensive formations. The Americans could take the offense back and hold it. Whip folded the final sheet, sealing the formula inside a weather-beaten toolkit manual. "Tomorrow, I start teaching the crew chiefs. By the end of the week, every pilot in this squadron will fly like you did today." Collins raised his coffee in a quiet toast. "To the fix that shouldn't exist." Whip tapped his cup against it. "To the war, it's going to end sooner." Outside, the engines of distant P-51s cooled in the night air. In the dark, they looked identical, rows of sleeping predators. But after tomorrow, once Whip's formula spread through the ranks, they would no longer be just Mustangs. They would be something the Luftwaffe had no word for. Faster than Germany could climb, cooler than Germany could catch, and finally, after years of blood and attrition, dominant on every inch of sky. The formula wasn't just a fix, it was the turning of the tide.